Mr. President, let me associate myself with the remarks of the Minority Leader, Senator Schumer. What happened yesterday in the courts of District of Columbia was on one side of the equation frightening and another side encouraging. Frightening that any administration would think that they can quash the free speech of members of Congress, that they can be indicting people, charging them with crimes for simply speaking out as an elected member of Congress. Like Senator Schumer said, there is no precedent that I can think of in American history. There has never been a president who used this Department of Justice to quiet Congress in this way. We have gone through many events in the history of the United States that are earth-shattering, the Civil War being the worst, but we've never seen this happen. The fact that the grand jury of residents of the District of Columbia stood up and rejected this indictment of two senators and several members of the House is proof positive that people still understand the basic values of our Constitution. And one of them is our freedom of expression, the freedom to speak, the freedom to express our point of view. They stood up yesterday in an extraordinary fashion. Why did it ever reach this point that the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia tried to quiet members of Congress because of the objection of the administration to what they were saying? This was a test, but I hope it was the last test. But we shouldn't be so naive as to believe it is. It is up to us, Democrats and Republicans, for good of this Constitution and the value of the good of the Congress and the value of the Constitution, to stand behind those members who are exercising their rights as elected members of the Congress. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, in another event which is worth noting, the FBI descended on Fulton County, Georgia, to seize hundreds of thousands of ballots from the 2020 presidential election. Reports indicate President Trump personally ordered the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, a prominent 2020 election denier, to go to Georgia for the raid. The president then spoke directly to the FBI agents who conducted the raid. To state the obvious, it is completely inappropriate for the president and the Director of National Intelligence to be personally involved in a domestic criminal investigation. But Attorney General Pam Bondi has allowed the president to weaponize her department and federal law enforcement to pursue his personal and political goals. Why did they target Fulton County? It's notorious, because this jurisdiction has been at the center of President Trump's false and baseless claims concerning so-called fraud in the 2020 election, an election he still refuses to acknowledge and concede. I remember well that recorded conversation on the telephone between the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Georgia Secretary of State. It was in early 2021, and President Trump directed the Georgia Secretary of State to, quote, find, close quote, the 11,780 votes he needed to swing the election his way. He said it. Those were his words, his voice. And I remember when he incited a mob of his most ardent supporters to storm this very Capitol, this very Senate chamber, to subvert the will of the people and overturn the results of a free and fair election. He failed, but now his end game for 2026 has become clear. He's working to rewrite the rules of the game and to rig the system to ensure he maintains his grip on power beyond the reach of the American people in a free and fair election. Don't believe me? Think about the past. Last year, in the spirit of his order to Georgia officials to find 11,780 votes, President Trump demanded that the state of Texas find him 5 more congressional seats before voters headed to the polls this coming November. Donald Trump demanded Republicans in the Texas legislature gerrymander 5 red seats in a redistricting scheme so he could cut his losses, literally, and hold on to the House after the upcoming midterm. In the meantime, the administration has deployed thousands of immigration enforcement agents to cities like Minneapolis and Chicago, cities and states that did not vote for President Trump. I never thought I'd witness an America where masked federal agents in military tactical gear violently arrest innocent Americans because of the color of their skin, the so-called Kavanaugh stops. An American where citizens like Chicagoan Miramar Martinez can be shot, 5 times by federal agents with impunity, be branded falsely as a domestic terrorist. Thankfully, unlike Renee Good, Alex Petty, and Silveria Villegas Gonzalez, Ms. Martinez survived and testified 2 weeks ago. And DHS has directed immigration agents to crash down the doors of our private homes to arrest people without any judicial warrant, in blatant disregard to the clear language of the Fourth Amendment. In the wake of this immigration enforcement surge and the ensuing chaos, Attorney General Bondi had the nerve in a letter to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to offer him a reprieve. All he had to do was to turn over the voter files in his state. Thankfully, he refused. An attorney for the state described it as, quote, a ransom note from the Attorney General. If you're Donald Trump, you want these voter rolls to push unwarranted purgers and disenfranchised voters, especially voters who aren't likely to support you in the next election. In fact, the Justice Department has now sued dozens of states for their voter rolls. All of this is textbook authoritarianism, vintage fascism, and I fear the President of the United States is working to rig the system to ensure that Republicans never lose another election. Has that thought crossed their mind? Listen to what Trump ally Steve Bannon said last week. We're going to have ICE surround the polling places. We'll never again allow an election to be stolen. You heard that right. Donald Trump and his allies want to deploy militarized agents to polling locations to intimidate and deter Americans from actually voting. In deploying ICE and attempting to deploy the National Guard, Trump has already established a precedent for paramilitary force that answers only to him patrolling our streets. Last week, Trump said the quiet part out loud. Here's what he said. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize voting. Those are the words of Donald Trump. Article 1 of the Constitution and decades of Supreme Court precedent make it clear that the president cannot take over the administration of elections from the states. I'm old enough to remember when Republicans actually cared about the Constitution and the concept of federalism. Imagine for a moment if Barack Obama or Joe Biden had called for nationalizing an election and told federal agents they could raid private homes without judicial warrants and approval. The president's aims are clear. He wants to make the case for the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from him so he can assuage his fragile ego and justify directly interfering in the 2026 and 2028 elections. Republican senators won't speak up, but the American people at the polls will. In the streets of Minneapolis and Chicago and in the halls of the U.S. Capitol, we hear their voices. We will do everything in our power to save our democracy from a president with such disdain for our Constitution and our democracy. I yield the floor.